Hello, Psychology of Learning students. So we are now in week 3, chapter 3. We're going to be talking about classical conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning. So let's get started. I'm going to begin by sharing the screen and going to the PowerPoint slides for chapter 3. These PowerPoint slides were created by Dr. Stephanie Stern in our faculty. So Pavlovian conditioning. There's going to be 3 videos about this chapter. This first video is going to talk about, we're going to do a practice activity, and then I'm going to talk about the elements of classical conditioning. Then for video 2, I'm going to talk about higher order conditioning and other aspects of classical conditioning. And then in video 3, extinction and the theories of conditioning. Remember that these PowerPoint slides are available to you if you go to course contents and then chapter 3 materials and click on that folder. The PowerPoint slides are right there for you. Okay, so to begin with, I want to have you do an activity. What I want you to do is to think of a behavior of your friends or your significant other or your child or your mom, someone that you see quite often, that they have a behavior that you wish they would stop. So think of a behavior that one of your friends or your significant other, your child, has that you wish they would stop. I'd like you to take out a sheet of paper, write that behavior down, and then design an intervention that you could use to get them to stop doing that behavior. Okay, so turn off this video. I know it just started, but turn it off, just pause it, not turn it off, but pause it and write down that behavior and come up with an intervention to get them to stop. And when you have that, then come back on. Okay, I'm assuming that you've come up with your intervention to stop a behavior of someone that's close to you has. And we'll talk about that later in this week. But let's begin by introducing you. I say introducing you to him, but you've heard of him a lot from your general psychology class, but Ivan Pavlov. And remember that Pavlov was a Russian physiologist, not a psychologist. And he did a lot of early work on the circulatory system and then was really studying the physiology of digestion. He was trying to understand what kind of hormones, what kind of chemicals are in the salivatory glands of animals and humans. He was trying to understand our digestive system. So he had rigged he used a surgical procedure on dogs in order to be able to collect their saliva, their digestive juices in a way where he could measure them. But what he found was that, and this is more saying, what he found is that the dogs were salivating before the food was even in their mouths. Sometimes they would salivate just after he entered the lab. Sometimes they would salivate when a dish that they had been served the food in was around them. And so it was really messing up his experiment. So this is a slide that sort of shows you, it's a classic slide in almost all of the psychology textbooks of what his apparatus looked like. And I know if you're a dog lover, you're looking at this and saying, this is not okay. So this is before a lot of the ethical guidelines were put in place. Those ethical guidelines began the late 1980s. I think it was 1987 was the year that the first APA ethical guidelines came out. So this is well before that period of time. And so from this led Pavlov to have to make a decision. He could either continue to study his digestive system, or he could try to understand why these animals were salivating when the food wasn't even in the room yet. And luckily for all of us in psychology, he decided to try to understand what was making the dog salivate when the dog wasn't even there. And in doing so, created an entire area of psychology, classical conditioning, sometimes we call it Pavlovian conditioning, that would not exist without him. And so I want to spend some time going through the elements of it, but rather than showing you the PowerPoint slide showed that is in your PowerPoint slides. There's one that I use when I'm teaching this with general psychology students that I think can be really useful, even though I'm presenting an overview to you guys, much more advanced students in a 3,000 level class. But it's a good overview of the whole system. So with classical conditioning, we take an unconditioned stimulus that leads to an unconditioned response. We identify these. So an unconditioned stimulus is any stimulus that's wired into the organism so that when that stimulus is present, a response will automatically occur. So an example of an unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response is if you eat food that's poisonous, the unconditioned response is that you're going to vomit. If I put a puff of air in your eye, that's the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response is you will blink. If I create like a big loud noise behind your back, like I'm standing behind you and you're facing this way, and all of a sudden I clash cymbals together, a big loud sound behind you, you're going to have as an unconditional response some kind of startle reflex. You may like stiffen up or become very fearful or turn around real fast. A baby will start to cry. The one, of course, that Pavlov used, if I'm going to put meat on a dog's tongue or meat powder on a dog's tongue or acidic food on a dog's tongue, then the dog is going to begin to salivate. And so the unconditioned stimulus is the food, the unconditioned response is the salivating. So a lot of our unconditioned responses are actually fear responses. They're responses that are built, or it's not just fear, they have a lot to do with survival. So fear is one that works really well. Getting sick from poisonous food works real well. Anything to do with mating or passing the genes along work real well. But these are all stimuli responses that the organism, human being, rabbit, pigeon, rat, are born with. You don't need to teach it to them. And then we have a whole bunch of stimuli that we call the NS, the neutral stimuli. So these neutral stimuli are, and it could be anything, looking at a black square, hearing a piece of music, just think of anything can be a neutral stimulus. So a neutral stimulus is something that if learning had not occurred, there'd be no response to these neutral stimuli. Now we're going to start pairing this neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. Now when you start pairing it with the unconditioned stimulus, we don't call it the neutral stimulus anymore. We call it the conditioned stimulus. So you pair the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, and the organism gives the unconditioned response. So CS-US, organism responds. CS-US, organism responds. CS-US, organism responds. Eventually, when you present the CS, the organism will respond even if the US is not present. And when they do that, we call it the CR, the conditioned response. So let's go through the famous example of Pavlov. I'm going to say that it was a bell, but other people, sometimes they call it a metronome. There's all different ones. But the unconditioned stimulus is the meat powder on the dog's tongue. The dog's response to the meat powder on his tongue is that he's going to salivate. And of course, we've got the neutral stimulus of a bell. You ring a bell, the dog isn't going to do anything. Well, what Pavlov did is he rang a bell, then gave them food. The dog salivated. Rang the bell, gave him food. The dog salivated. Ring the bell, gave him food. The dog salivated. It didn't take that many pairings before then he would ring the bell and the dog would start to salivate. The food wasn't even there yet, but the dog would start to salivate to the bell. And when the dog salivates to the bell, we call it the conditioned response. When the dog salivates to the food, we call it the unconditioned response. And you can see that the responses, the UR and the CR, are always the same. It's what they're responding to. Okay? So let me give another example. This is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but when I was sitting where you're sitting in my psychology of learning class as an undergraduate, it was in the 1980s. So a lot of you, most of you weren't born. Some of you have grandparents that are my age. But the joke that we were taught was that one of the famous people who was doing a lot of classical conditioning experiments at the time, that he was exploring the US and the UR using some of his heterosexual male graduate students. And what he would do is show these graduate students a picture of a nude male, and of course the graduate student would become aroused. So that's the US and the UR. They then took a neutral stimulus, a picture of boots, woman's boots, and they would pair the boots with the picture of the nude woman. So picture of boots, picture of nude woman, the man becomes aroused. Picture of boots, picture of nude woman, the man becomes aroused. Picture of boots, picture of nude woman, the man becomes aroused. It didn't take that many pairings of that to then you show the male graduate student a picture of boots, and what do you think happens? He becomes aroused. Now, why it was funny was because when I was in graduate school, they were saying that those graduate students at that time working under this very famous person, these men would now be in their late 70s or 80s. So the joke was that if you go to the local Dillard's or Macy's and you go to the women's area where they're selling women's boots, if you see a man who keeps walking around there, they might have been in their study. And so it's kind of a funny joke that we had. But I hope this is a good overview for you of the major elements of classical conditioning. Let's go back now to the PowerPoint slides that you're using in your class. There we go. The elements of classical conditioning. And you can see that before conditioning, we've got the food leading, the unconditioned stimulus of the food leading to salivating, the unconditioned response. The whistle, the neutral stimulus, leads to nothing, no salivation. However, during conditioning, we're going to pair the whistle or the bell or the metronome to the food, and the dog salivate. So whistle, food, salivate, whistle, food, salivate. And after conditioning, the whistle alone will lead to the salivating. So now we're going to call the salivating a conditioned response. And the whistle, instead of being a neutral stimulus, we're going to call it the conditioned stimulus. So we know that there are two distinct types of reflexes, the unconditional and the conditional. And the unconditional reflexes are the inborn, permanent, found in all members of a species. They occur without having been learned. These are like what we're talking about. If I blow a puff of air in your eye, you're going to blink. If I feed you something that makes you sick, you're going to vomit. Or if I feed you poisonous food, you're going to vomit. We also have the conditional reflexes. These are our CRs. These are the responses that we're learning from the environment. And they vary between individuals, and they depend on the conditions in the situation and what you've learned in the past, what pairings have occurred for you. So we talk about the unconditioned reflex is when you're salivating, when the dog is salivating to the food. The unconditioned stimulus is going to be that food. So the unconditioned response is the behavior evoked by the US, in this case, the salivating to the food. The conditioned reflex is when the conditioned stimulus leads to that response. So the neutral stimulus, in this case, the whistle, is not important to survival, but it gets paired over and over again with the unconditioned stimulus and will lead to that conditioned response. Okay. How does a neutral stimulus come to be a conditioned stimulus? Any stimulus can become a conditioned stimulus if it's regularly paired with the unconditioned stimulus. And we're going to talk about in video 2 about how important those pairings are and what do we call the pairings and what are the different ways you can pair them together and which ones work better than which ones don't. One thing that's really important is that we do not call it classical conditioning, or we don't call it Pavlovian conditioning if the CS or the US depend on the responses that the animal or the person makes. So remember, the dog didn't have to salivate or do anything else in order to get the food. It's not called classical or operant conditioning. I'm sorry, it's not called classical or Pavlovian conditioning if the dog had to do something in order to get the food. okay? Or if the dog, for us to call it classical conditioning, the CS and the US have to be presented together regardless of what the animal does. So the puff of air comes before the blinking, and if we're going to pair something to it, let's say we're going to show you a black square, a puff of air. Those things have to happen together regardless of what you're doing in order for us to say, oh, your blinking to the black square was caused or due to classical conditioning. Okay, so the CS and the US have to be presented together. In this case, the bell, or I think they were doing the whistle, or the metronome and the food have to be presented together regardless of what the dog does in order for us to say classical conditioning occurred. Okay, now we are ready for the second video. So you can take a little break or go right to the second video. I hope you found this helpful.